wasn't cruel, he wasn't greedy, he wasn't even brave. Stephen of Blois was not the kind of man history is supposed to fear, and yet he is the man who broke England. When King Henry I lay dying in Normandy, his court gathered for a final command. His only legitimate child, Matilda, would inherit the throne. It was not tradition, it was law. And one by one, the nobles, grumbling, hesitating, resisting, swore their loyalty. Some did so with clenched jaws, others with veiled contempt, but they all did it, including Stephen. He was there, he made the vow, he said the words. And God heard him, but words are easy, thrones are not. Stephen left Normandy quietly after the king's death. No fanfare, no declaration, just a swift return to England and a sudden appearance in London. Matilda was still mourning. Still across the sea, still trusting, the door was ajar, and Stephen stepped through. It wasn't a coup, not in the traditional sense. No heads rolled, no blood stained the altar, just a coronation, quick, clean, and approved by the archbishop. By the time Matilda learned what had happened, her crown was already on someone else's head. Why did he do it? Was it ambition, fear, a sense of duty twisted into delusion? No one truly knows, and perhaps that's the most terrifying thing. Stephen never seemed like a villain. He simply looked reasonable. Gentle eyes, a soft voice, a pious reputation. And behind it all, the weight of a promise shattered so quietly, no one heard it until it was too late. He didn't kill to take the throne, not yet. He just broke something sacred, something older than crowns and stronger than blood, the chain of royal oath. And once it broke, everything else followed. The war didn't begin with a sword. It began with a smile. And from that smile would come 2 decades of chaos, starvation, torture, and a kingdom torn into pieces. The king was dying, and everyone in the room was lying. It was the winter of 1135. King Henry I, last true son of William the Conqueror, was rotting from the inside. Some said it was lampreys. Others whispered it was divine punishment. But whatever it was, it left him bedridden and bitter, surrounded by nobles who hated his daughter but feared his temper even more. Matilda, his only legitimate heir, was not there. She was in Normandy, far from the throne, far from the dagger-filled smiles of her father's court. Henry knew they would never follow a woman willingly, so he summoned them all one last time to force loyalty from their lips. The barons came. Some by duty, some by threat, some just to watch him die. And one of them was Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew, soft-spoken, courteous, and always eager to serve. When the oath was demanded, they all swore, not out of love, not even out of fear, but because Henry's eyes, even as death closed in, still knew how to promise hell. Stephen bent the knee. His voice didn't shake. His words were perfect. "I will honor the succession of Empress Matilda." That was the phrase. That was the contract. That was the lie. Outside the walls of the royal chamber, no one knew. England waited, uneasy, divided, fragile. The Norman barons remembered war. The Saxon lands still remembered conquest. The clergy remembered every promise made to God and every one broken for gold. The realm was not united. It was stitched together by oaths, and oaths, once torn, unravel kingdoms. Henry held on for weeks, every breath a fight. Every messenger from Matilda, a reminder that time was slipping away. But she never arrived, and when the king finally gave in to the blackness, He left behind no roar, no final threat. Just a kingdom balanced on the edge of a knife and a promise that had already begun to rot. Stephen left court soon after, quiet, respectful. He returned to Boulogne, to his own lands, to pray, or so they believed. What he actually returned to was preparation. Letters were already being written, coins minted, a strategy unfolding beneath the veil of mourning. He didn't wait to grieve. He didn't wait for her. He waited for no one. Because Stephen knew something no one else dared to say aloud. In England, power does not wait for permission. And Matilda, with her royal blood and imperial title, might have been the rightful heir, but she was also a woman. And that meant time was not on her side. And so it began, not with rebellion, but with calculation. Not with an army, but with a ship. As the bells of Henry's funeral echoed over Normandy, Stephen's sails were already rising. His path was clear, the throne was unguarded, the barons were uneasy, and the archbishop was persuadable. No blood was spilled, no gates were broken, no swords were raised, and yet England had a new king. When Stephen's ship reached the English coast, it was not met with resistance. It was met with silence. The kind of silence that lives in the cracks between loyalty and fear. Matilda was still across the channel. Her claim was untouched, but her presence absent. And in politics, absence is not patience, it's weakness. Stephen didn't march. He rode, light, fast, smiling. He arrived in London like a grieving nephew come to honor a dead uncle. But behind the sorrowed eyes was a clock ticking faster than anyone could hear. He visited the right nobles. He visited the Archbishop of Canterbury. He visited the Treasury. And with each visit, he pulled one more thread from Matilda's fragile web of inheritance. The Archbishop hesitated. For a moment, it almost fell apart. He reminded Stephen, publicly, that he had sworn loyalty to the Empress, that breaking that oath would tear the soul of the realm in half. But Stephen, ever the polished courtier, countered not with threat, but with performance. He claimed the barons had begged him to rule, that the people feared instability, that a strong man was needed now, not someday, not tomorrow, not when a woman found her way back across the sea. And then he made a promise that changed everything. He swore to uphold the laws of Edward the Confessor, to protect the church, to respect the nobles, to rule with fairness and mercy. It was a brilliant lie because it wasn't really a lie. Stephen believed himself to be a good man. That made it all the more dangerous. Within days, London declared for him, and once the capital bent, the crown followed. On December 26, 1135, barely 3 weeks after Henry's death, Stephen of Blois was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. He stood beneath the arches, robe of state heavy on his shoulders, eyes closed in piety as oil touched his forehead. The sacred rites performed, the barons in attendance, the church watching, and for a moment it all seemed right, peaceful, legitimate. But there was one problem, a quiet one, a deadly one: the oaths. Everyone in that room had broken them, every noble who raised a cup, every bishop who blessed the crown, every hand that applauded. They had all sworn to another. And now they were ruled by guilt as much as by loyalty. That guilt would not die, it would fester. It would rot the core of Stephen's reign, even as he smiled and handed out favors. Because loyalty bought in fear is loyalty that breaks the moment wind shifts. And in England, The winds shift often. Stephen did not steal the throne in darkness. He took it in daylight with applause. And that, perhaps, was the greatest crime of all. The crown was on his head, but every glance around him asked if it belonged there. Stephen had his coronation, his seal, his throne, but no amount of holy oil could erase the fact that he was wearing another person's crown. Matilda was still alive, still royal, still dangerous, and the oath, that damned oath, still lingered in the minds of every man who had sworn it. They had broken it, yes, but they hadn't forgotten it. It began as murmurs, in court, in monasteries, in cold castle halls where barons drank too much and whispered too loud. Some said Matilda had no right. Others said Stephen had no honor, but all of them agreed on one thing: this would not hold. The Archbishop of Canterbury, once hesitant, now backed Stephen officially, but in the shadows, other voices stirred. The Bishop of Winchester, Stephen's own brother Henry, began to carve out a position not just as cleric, but as kingmaker. He promised loyalty to Stephen, but also left doors open for Matilda. It was a game of masks. Everyone was swearing loyalty, and no one meant a word of it. And then came the first shock: Robert of Gloucester, half-brother to Matilda, son of Henry I, powerful, respected, quiet until now. He broke ranks, declared Stephen a usurper and Matilda the true heir. It wasn't a rebellion, not yet, but it was a fracture, a deep one, the kind that doesn't heal. Robert wasn't alone. One by one, lords in the West began to resist royal orders. Some refused taxes, others fortified castles, and the worst of them, those who didn't choose either side, just started taking whatever they wanted. Raids became common, bandits multiplied, local justice vanished, the roads turned dangerous, and Stephen, barely a year into his reign, faced a kingdom slipping out of his fingers, but he still believed he could hold it. He traveled endlessly, issuing charters, granting favors, buying silence with silver. He tried to be generous, to be beloved, to make them forget how he got the crown in the first place. But the thing about legitimacy is, it either is or it is. You can't build it, you can't fake it. And the more Stephen tried, the more obvious it became. He didn't rule because of who he was. He ruled because Matilda wasn't here. But Matilda was coming. By 1138, she had crossed into England with forces, banners, and a cause sharpened by betrayal. The Queen of Germany, the daughter of Henry I. The woman promised a throne and robbed of it while in mourning. She wasn't here to make peace. She was here to reclaim what was already hers. And so the wind that had once whispered doubt now screamed rebellion. There would be no turning back. Stephen had won the crown with silence, but he would keep it only through war. It didn't feel like a war. It felt like the country had stopped breathing. There was no great battle to mark the start, no declaration, no drums, just a slow unraveling. Law faded first. Local lords stopped answering the king's writ. Castles that once opened their gates in Stephen's name began to shut them tight. And those without castles, priests, peasants, widows, were left to fend for themselves as wolves circled the edges of every road. Not literal wolves. Worse. Men with swords and nothing to lose. Stephen called it treason. He sent riders. He ordered arrests. But the orders meant little without loyalty to carry them. Every rider sent west disappeared. Every sheriff replaced was met with defiance. England wasn't fighting one war, it was breaking into 100 private ones, baron against baron, church against baron, village against its own lord. The crown still existed, but it had no weight. Some towns swore to Stephen, others to Matilda, others to no one at all. In York, the people tore down royal banners and raised none in their place. In the West, Robert of Gloucester built alliances like a spider, quiet, patient, but deadly. He didn't fight Stephen head-on, not yet. He bled him with delay, disruption, and doubt. And then the castles started changing, not the ones built to defend borders, the ones built to control people. Hundreds of them, small, crude, unauthorized, adulterine castles, that's what they were called. Stephen's barons built them without permission, and he let them, because he needed their loyalty more than their obedience. In exchange, they ruled their territories like kings. They hanged men without trial. They tortured for coin. They burned farms because they could. And Stephen, surrounded by the wolves he had fed, looked away. The countryside became unrecognizable. Roads were empty, fields unharvested, churches looted. Some priests buried their relics and fled. Others stood their ground and were nailed to their own doors. Famine crept in not because food was gone, but because no one could move it. Merchants stayed behind their gates. Mothers stopped naming their children. Hope became a kind of heresy, and still Matilda waited. She had support. She had her half-brother, she had Normandy, but she didn't strike yet, not fully. She let England rot just long enough for Stephen's grip to loosen, for trust to crack, for whispers in court to become plans, because she knew. Once a king lets the land turn against him, the throne becomes an island, and islands sink. Stephen did not retreat. He refused. He clung to the crown like a man holding his breath underwater, waiting for the tide to change. But it didn't. It crashed. In 1141, outside the walls of Lincoln, he rode into battle, not to defend his realm, but to prove it was still his. He wore the crown into battle, but by nightfall it lay trampled in the mud. February 1141. The walls of Lincoln rose grey against the winter sky, its garrison loyal to Stephen, but surrounded, besieged, exhausted. Reinforcements were needed, but when word reached Stephen of the siege, he didn't hesitate, he didn't negotiate, he didn't consider retreat. He rode to the city himself, because in his mind, kings did not wait behind walls, they led. Even if they had no army left willing to follow. His forces were ragged, pieced together from scattered barons and mercenaries. He had numbers, perhaps, but what he didn't have was momentum. Robert of Gloucester met him in open field, Matilda's banner high above the frozen grass, and for the first time since the coronation, the two sides truly collided. Not through rumor, not through whispers, but steel. Stephen fought like a man possessed. That much is clear, even his enemies admitted it. He shattered lances, crushed helmets, swung his axe until it cracked in his hands, but for all his fury, he was alone. One by one, the nobles on his side broke ranks, turned their horses and fled, some out of fear, some out of strategy, and some, perhaps, because they no longer believed he was king. By noon, it was over. Stephen had been surrounded. His horse was dead, his sword lost, and he stood there in the mire, cloaked in royal cloth, eyes dark, breath steaming in the cold, as armored men closed in around him. They didn't kill him, That would have made him a martyr. They stripped him of weapons, of dignity, of control. They dragged him away like a traitor. He was imprisoned in Bristol, not in chains, but not in comfort either. The King of England, trapped in a cell inside his own kingdom. The crown did not follow him. It remained behind, unseen, uncertain, as the court collapsed into panic. Some nobles switched sides immediately, others went quiet. The throne itself stood hollow. And yet, even in chains, Stephen refused to break. His letters continued. His allies regrouped. His queen, Matilda of Boulogne, rallied armies in his name. And across the land, a strange silence took hold. Because for a brief moment, it looked as though Matilda had won. Her rival was in a cell, her enemies in retreat, the throne within reach. But Matilda was not Henry, she was not Stephen, and she was not ready for what came next. She had the crown within reach and dropped it with both hands. Matilda entered London not as a conqueror, but as a queen in waiting. Stephen was locked away, his armies scattered, his lords divided. The church hesitated, but not firmly. And for the first time in years, it looked as if the realm would shift, quietly, decisively, back to its rightful line. But Matilda didn't just want the throne. She wanted it on her terms. And that was where everything began to crumble. She arrived cold, proud, and distant. She spoke of law, of justice, of divine right, but never of mercy. Her father had ruled with iron. She tried to rule with stone. The people of London, exhausted from famine and bloodshed, had waited for a savior. Instead, they saw a queen who didn't kneel, didn't thank, didn't listen. She levied taxes before she wore the crown. She punished the city for its former loyalty to Stephen. She treated England like a possession already won, not a kingdom still wounded. Even her closest allies began to flinch. Robert of Gloucester pleaded with her to soften. The Bishop of Winchester urged her to show grace. She ignored them both, because in her mind, victory had already been declared. Stephen's fall had confirmed it, but no throne holds itself, especially not in a land where loyalty is earned in hunger, not heredity. And then London turned, quietly at first, murmurs in the streets, market stalls closing early, doors bolted before dusk. And then came the fire, riots broke out. Stones were thrown. Nobles began fleeing under cover of night. And Matilda, days away from her formal coronation, was forced to abandon the capital she had just claimed. She escaped under guard, humiliated, not by battle but by rejection, not by an army but by the people themselves. It was not defeat, but it was worse. It was refusal. Meanwhile, in the West, Stephen's wife, Queen Matilda of Boulogne, had not stopped fighting. She raised fresh troops, called in mercenaries, pressured the church, and within months a trade was brokered. Stephen, the prisoner king, was exchanged for Robert of Gloucester, Matilda's champion. The board flipped again. Stephen was free. Matilda had lost her momentum, and the war that had seemed so close to ending began all over again. But something had changed, something deeper, because after this, Stephen no longer looked like a usurper. He looked like a survivor, and the years ahead would not be about who deserved the crown. They would be about who could endure it. He had his freedom, his throne, and his title, but something was missing, and he knew it the moment he put the crown back on. Stephen returned not as a triumphant king, but as a man patched together by compromise. His release was not a victory, it was a transaction, one man for another. His enemies still held half the realm, the nobles still whispered, and Matilda, though battered, had not vanished. She had merely shifted, retreated, rearmed. The war was not over, it had simply grown quieter and crueler. The years that followed were not filled with glory, they were filled with rot, raids, broken truces, skirmishes no one bothered to count. Castles fell, rebuilt, fell again. Towns burned, rebuilt, burned again. No clear winner, no clear cause, just two names carved into the bones of a land that no longer cared which one sat the throne. And at the center of it all was Stephen, still king, but no longer whole. His allies grew fewer, his enemies more cunning. His court, once filled with ambitious barons, now swelled with opportunists who swore loyalty in the morning and sold secrets by dusk. Trust was dead, even family strained. His own son, Eustace, had grown into a man, ambitious, impatient, angry, and he wanted to be more than a prince. He wanted to rule. Stephen saw in Eustace something of himself, only harder, colder, sharper. The boy didn't want peace. He wanted conquest. He urged his father to crush the rebels, to wipe out the Empress's line, to finish it once and for all. But Stephen hesitated. Something inside him, some fragment of the man who once swore an oath and meant it, was still there. Or perhaps he was simply too tired to burn the world again. Then came the blow no army could deliver. Eustace, his heir, his son, his last thread of legacy, collapsed and died. Some said it was poison, others a fever. But the truth didn't matter, only the silence afterward, because in that moment, Stephen stopped being a king trying to win. He became a father with nothing left to give. The crown weighed heavier than ever. The war continued. But Stephen no longer pushed. He held ground, made gestures, nodded through councils. His eyes dimmed, his voice softened, and those closest to him began to wonder, not if he would surrender, but when. Because there is a kind of defeat worse than losing. It is staying alive long enough to see that none of it mattered. And when a young boy named Henry, son of Matilda, arrived with fresh banners and a cleaner claim, the barons looked at him not with fear, but with relief. They were tired, the kingdom was tired, and Stephen had no heir left to fight for. He didn't surrender with a sword at his throat. He surrendered with nothing left in his hands. By 1153, England had bled for nearly 2 decades. Entire generations had grown up knowing only siege walls and shifting allegiances. Crops failed not from drought, but from hoof and fire. Churches locked their doors, nobles built fortresses instead of homes, and the people, those still alive, stopped caring who ruled as long as someone finally did. Stephen was still king, but his voice no longer moved armies. His decrees reached fewer ears. His eyes had dulled since Eustace's death. He walked slower, spoke less, trusted no one. He had won battles, survived betrayals, outlasted excommunications, but in the end the crown no longer sat on his head. It sat in his shadow. And then came the boy, Henry of Anjou, 17 years old, sharp, cautious. Backed by Normandy, flanked by battle-hardened knights, and most damning of all, welcomed by barons who once swore to Stephen. Not because they loved him, not even because they feared him, but because they could finally see an end. The negotiations were quiet, almost embarrassed. Not treaties, but traded looks. Not alliances, but exhausted nods. When the two sides met, there was no fire left, just ash. Stephen had lost his son, his cause, and his grip on the realm. But he hadn't yet lost his name. And if he let this boy become heir, if he signed that final parchment, then maybe, just maybe, his legacy wouldn't be written entirely in ruin. And so, in the city of Winchester, in the presence of former enemies and tired allies, Stephen laid down the future he no longer had. He named Henry his successor, not out of defeat, not out of grace, but out of necessity. Because the war had cost everything except the ability to stop it, he returned to court a quieter man than ever. No one cheered, no one rebelled, they simply accepted it. And in that silence, the war ended, not with a sword, but with a sigh. The following year, Stephen died, alone, sick, uncelebrated, no great funeral, no mourning in the streets, just a royal burial for a king the world had already forgotten. What do you call a man who won the throne, ruled for nearly 20 years, and still left behind nothing? Not a tyrant, not a hero, just a warning. Stephen of Blois never set out to destroy a kingdom. He wanted to lead it, protect it, wear the crown with dignity. But intentions are irrelevant when the price is this high. He broke a vow, and in doing so, shattered the one thing no king can rule without: belief. The people stopped believing in law, in order, in each other. And long before he died, England had already buried him in spirit. He wasn't the worst king. He wasn't even the weakest. He was simply the man in the middle. Between power and right, between chaos and peace, between the crown and the grave. And when his story ended, it didn't echo, it faded. But history doesn't forget what silence hides. His cousin Matilda would never wear the crown, but her son would. Henry II would take the throne his mother was denied. And as for Stephen's own son, Eustace, buried before his time, burned out by a war he never chose, his name would vanish like a shadow swallowed by night. Some inherit crowns, others inherit curses. If stories like this stay with you, you're not alone. Subscribe to hear more truths buried under royal lies. And if you haven't yet, watch the rise of Matilda's son Henry and the downfall of Stephen's own blood in the execution of Prince Conradin. 2 heirs, 2 ends, one kingdom that never healed.